I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. I am 70 years old. I built a massive business empire from the ground up, starting with nothing. I thought I had a family that respected everything I gave my life to build. My son gave me a luxury trip to Cambodia. Dad, you deserve to relax, he told me as he handed over the first-class ticket. But less than 5 minutes after he pulled away from the terminal, a complete stranger grabbed my arm. He was pale and shaking uncontrollably. "Do not get on that plane," he whispered. "I just overheard your son on the phone. If you step onto that flight, your life as you know it is over." I froze. You know how she is, Dad, and what he told me next shattered my entire reality into a million pieces. If you are watching this, take a deep breath. Wajis, take a deep breath. The betrayal I uncovered that day will make you question every single person you trust. My heavy suitcase rolled with a sharp scrape across the polished floor under the towering glass ceilings of Denver International Airport. You know how she is. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning, the kind of bright day that usually makes you feel energized and ready for whatever comes next. At 70, you know how she is, Dad. I was finally doing what everyone, especially my doctors, had been begging me to do for a decade. Step back. For 40 long years, I poured every ounce of my heart, sweat, you know how she is, Dad, and soul into Caldwell commercial properties. I built it how she is, Dad. I built it from a tiny rented desk into a real estate juggernaut spanning the entire American West. I missed countless holidays. I missed family birthdays. I sacrificed my own youth, my feats, so my family would never have to know the bitter taste of being broke. And now I was finally handing the keys over to my 38-year-old son, Preston. We stood right outside the VIP departure gate. You know how she is, Dad. Preston looked sharp in a custom navy suit, the exact tailored style I loved wearing when I was his age. He was the golden child I raised to take over the mantle, the man born to sit at the head of the boardroom table. You know how she is, Dad. He checked his solid gold watch, a gift I bought him when he closed his first $1 million deal, and flashed a bright, confident smile before handing me a thick leather binder containing my complete travel itinerary. 3 full weeks, entirely off the grid, Dad, Preston said, his tone rich with warmth and assurance. No cell service, no board meetings, no frantic emails. Just you, the jungle, and total peace at the finest eco-resort in Cambodia. You earned this more than anyone. You built this empire. Now, let me run it for a while. I patted his shoulder, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of pride. I had raised a strong, capable man who cared about my well-being. I told him. I trusted him completely. We shared a tight, meaningful hug right there at the curb, and I watched his black lug right there at the curb, and I merged his black luxury SUV pull out. I felt a wave of pure relief, ready to start the next chapter of my life. I turned around, grabbed the leather handle of my bag, and walked toward the automatic glass doors to check in for my international flight. Me for money. You know how she is, Dad, and at that exact second, my comfortable world shattered into razor-sharp pieces. Excuse me, sir. Stop right there. A hand clamped down hard on my forearm. The grip was unusually tight, almost desperate. Startled, I spun around, ready to snap at whoever was grabbing me. You know how she is, Dad. Standing there was an older man wearing the blue uniform of a TSA agent. His plastic badge read Vince. He looked to be around my age, maybe late 50s. But what made my words die in my throat was the look on his face. He was pale as a ghost. Beads of sweat lined his forehead, and his eyes darted around nervously as if hidden snipers were watching us. 4. Before I could even ask what was going on, he pulled me hard behind a thick concrete pillar, completely out of sight from the drop-off lanes and terminal windows. "You know how she is, Dad. What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, pulling my arm back. "I have a flight to catch." "Do not get on that plane," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely get the words out. "Please, sir, just hear me out." I stared at him, utterly confused and growing irritated. I asked him if he knew who I was, wondering if this was some bizarre prank or an attempt to shake me down for money. "I don't know your name," he said, swallowing hard, "but I know the man who just dropped you off. I was taking a smoke break behind the concrete barrier right by the VIP lane. I saw your son drop you off. I saw you hug him. You know how she is, Dad. But the second you turned your back to walk inside, his entire face changed. It was like a switch flipped." I frowned, a cold, uncomfortable chill creeping up the back of my neck. "What are you talking about?" Vince wiped his sweaty forehead with the back of his hand. He got back into his car, but he didn't drive off. "You know how she is, Dad." He rolled down the window, pulled out a cheap plastic phone, a burner, and made a call. He was furious, sir. He was giving aggressive orders. "You know how she is, Dad." I told the officer he must have gotten it wrong. Preston was the CEO of a major corporation. "You know how she is, Dad." He was probably just dealing with a sudden contractor crisis or handling a difficult client. "No," Vince insisted, grabbing my arm again, even tighter this time. "Listen to me closely." He kept his eyes locked on your back as you walked away, and then he said, "The old man is boarding now. He'll be completely off the grid for 3 weeks. Transfer all the debt to his personal accounts right now, and file the paperwork to his personal accounts right now. The paperwork for the bankruptcy proceedings immediately. Make sure he takes the fall for everything. Tuesday. Well, you know how she is, Dad." Those words hung in the cold morning air like a brutal sentence. Transfer the debt. File for bankruptcy. Make sure he takes the fall. My world stopped turning. The bustling background noise of the airport, the automated announcements echoing over the loudspeakers. "You know how she is, Dad," the deep rumble of commercial jets taking off in the distance. It all faded into a dull, heavy buzz. My entire focus narrowed down to the terrified face of the man standing in front of me. I stared at Vince, searching his eyes for any sign of a lie. I looked for any proof that he was crazy, hallucinating, or trying to extort me. But there was nothing there except pure, raw fear. "You know how she is, Dad. Why would a regular security officer risk his stable job to pull a wealthy passenger aside and tell such a specific, terrifying lie? He had no reason to do that." My breath hitched. A sharp pain, "You know how she is, Dad." A sharp pain gripped my chest so hard I thought I was suffering a heart attack right there on the pavement. Preston, my own flesh and blood, the boy I taught to ride a bike. "You know how she is, Dad," the man I trusted with my entire life's work. He was setting me up. He planned to wipe me out and leave me with nothing while I was trapped thousands of miles away. I demanded that Vince repeat every single word he heard, every detail, leaving nothing out. Vince nodded quickly, talking fast while checking over his shoulder. He said, "Transfer the debt to his personal accounts. File the paperwork for the bankruptcy proceedings immediately." Then he said, "Make sure he takes the fall." "Sir, I don't know what kind of business you're in, but devastating blow. God. If you get on that 20-hour flight and setting you up for a devastating blow. If you get on that 20-hour flight and stay off the grid for 3 weeks like he said, you'll come back to nothing. Or worse, the moment set back on American soil, federal agents will be waiting to take you into custody." My mind of brutal corporate 1,000 miles a minute 4 decades of brutal corporate survival instincts kicked in instantly. I fought off the crushing emotional agony of a father realizing his son was planning his absolute destruction. No, I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to stay clear-headed, shoving the heartbreak deep down inside so I could focus entirely on survival. "Thank you," I told Vince. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my wallet and shoved it into his trembling hand. "You never saw me today. You heard nothing. Go back to work right now and forget my face." He'd laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad." Vince nodded rapidly, visibly relieved to get out of the situation. He took the money, turned around, and melted back into the crowded terminal, leaving me completely alone. I stood frozen behind that pillar. The thick travel folder felt like a heavy block of concrete in my hand. Cambodia, dense jungles, ancient temples, no cell service, no internet. It wasn't a generous, loving gift from an appreciative son. "You know how she is, Dad." It was a isolation chamber. A calculated trap designed to make me blind and deaf so he could dismantle my financial empire and frame me as his scapegoat without any interference. I leaned back against the cold concrete, my chest heaving. A sharp ache hit my heart, born from a betrayal, so deep it permanently broke something inside me. But then the overwhelming grief began to burn away, replaced by an icy, ruthless focus I knew all too well. I had faced down the coldest corporate raiders in the business. I had survived market crashes that wiped out men half my age. I didn't survive 40 years in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by being a naive victim. If my own flesh and blood thought I was just a helpless old man he could throw away, he was about to learn a brutal lesson. But before I tore my family apart, I needed undeniable proof. I had to know for sure if the man I raised was truly capable of destroying me. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking from a toxic mix of deep dread and pure rage. I was about to make a call to test the depth of this scheme. I forced my legs to move away from the concrete column. I didn't want to draw attention to myself or look like a man whose entire universe collapsed, gripping the handles of my Lobs Traveler's suitcase. My leather suitcase. I bypassed the check-in counters and merged into the morning crowd of crowties and merged into the morning crowd of travelers. "How she is, Dad." My vision narrowed as the bright fluorescent lights of the Denver terminal hummed overhead. I needed privacy. I needed a spot where I could think. Somewhere, how she is, somewhere nobody could see my hands shaking. I ducked into the nearest men's restroom, walked past the sinks, and locked myself inside the end stall. "You know how she is, Dad." The space was tight and smelled faintly of industrial bleach. I lowered the lid, and sat down heavily. The cold porcelain seeped through my trousers, but I barely felt it. My chest was tight, every breath requiring a deliberate, painful effort. I stared down at my phone screen. The wallpaper was a photo of Preston and me from a fishing trip in Montana 5 years ago, taken shortly after my wife, Beatrice, passed away. "You know how she is, Dad." His arm was thrown over my shoulder, both of us smiling. It looked like a picture of absolute family loyalty. Now, that smile looked like a heavy, suffocating mask. I had to be certain. I had to hear his voice. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. I couldn't let him catch any panic in my tone. If Vince was telling the truth, and my son was telling my son, was orchestrating my financial execution, showing my hand too early would be a fatal mistake. I tapped Preston's name on the screen and brought the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. With every chime, my heavy heartbeat thundered in my ears. Part of me prayed he wouldn't answer. How she is, Dad. I secretly hoped it would go straight to voicemail so I could delay the inevitable confrontation. On the fourth ring, the line clicked open. Hey, Dad, did you forget something already? Preston's voice came through the receiver, smooth, cheerful, and entirely relaxed. There was no tremor of guilt. You know how she is, Dad. No rushed anxiety you'd expect from a man executing a massive corporate coup. He sounded identical to the dutiful son who had hugged me goodbye just 10 minutes earlier. He sounded completely innocent. No. I forced a light chuckle, rubbing the bridge of my nose hard. Got my passport. Got the itinerary. I'm just standing in line for security right now. Great. Preston laughed softly, a warm, rich sound. You gave me a quick scare. You know how she is, Dad. You know how you get with losing your reading glasses when you travel. I was about to turn the car around and look for you at the curb. The casual concern in his voice was deeply disorienting. How could a man actively setting up his own father sound so genuine, so full of care? The disconnect made my head spin. Fontana about it. A picture flashed in my mind of him sitting in his luxury SUV, navigating the airport exit traffic with one hand on the wheel while effortlessly lying to my face. You know how she is, Dad. I had to push through the emotional fog. I needed to throw out the bait. Actually, Preston, I started, keeping my tone completely offhand. You know how she is, Dad, like I was bringing up a minor inconvenience, like a flight delay. I called because something strange happened. I turned my phone back to check an email and saw a weird voicemail from a senior executive at First National Bank. There was a pause on the line, a tiny fraction of a second. But after 40 years of high-stakes real estate negotiations, my ears were trained to catch the smallest hesitation. An ordinary person would have missed it, but I caught it instantly. First National? Preston repeated. The warmth was still there, but that casual ease had tightened up just a fraction. What did they want? The message was choppy, I continued in a slightly confused, grandfatherly tone. Bad signal, but the banker sounded urgent. He mumbled something about a massive debt transfer and kept mentioning bankruptcy. To be honest, it sounded like he was trying to verify a sudden corporate filing. You know how she is, Dad. I thought I should call you before I board a 20-hour flight, just to make sure we don't have a weird glitch in our payroll accounts, or some wire fraud happening while my back is turned. I held my breath. I waited in the stale air of the bathroom stall, listening through the speaker to the faint hum of his car engine in the background. If he panicked, of his excuse in the background. If he panicked, if he stuttered, or if he made a clumsy excuse to hang up, I would know with absolute certainty that Vince was telling the truth. I closed my eyes tightly, bracing myself for the absolute worst. Instead, Preston let out a long, exaggerated sigh followed by a warm, reassuring chuckle. Oh, Dad, he laughed softly. You know how she is, Dad. You really can't turn off that competitive business brain for even a second, can you? Even when you're standing in line for security heading to a tropical resort. Relax. You know how she is, Dad. You know me, I answered smoothly. I hear the word bankruptcy and my blood pressure spikes. Please, Dad. Take a breath, Preston said. His response was absolute perfection, a masterclass in corporate reassurance. There is no fraud. Nobody's going bankrupt. I know exactly why First National called you. Remember the Silverstone Plaza project? The old warehouse district development we shelved last year? I blinked. Silverstone Plaza. You know how she is, Dad. It was a massive commercial zoning project that had stalled out due to complex permitting issues. It had been a heavy financial burden on the books, a piece of dead weight we carried for a long time. Yes, I said cautiously. Of course, I remember Silverstone. What does that have to do with a sudden bankruptcy filing? I'm shifting the debt how she is. From Silverstone into a newly formed subsidiary to liquidate that dead weight, Preston explained effortlessly. It's a standard strategic move. By moving that specific bad debt into an isolated holding company and filing for a localized restructuring, we get a massive tax write-off for this quarter without touching our primary corporate structure. Our legal team finalized the strategy yesterday afternoon. You know how she is, Dad. First National was probably just trying to confirm the automated transfer protocols before processing the final paperwork. You know how she is. His explanation was incredibly logical and legally sound. It was precisely the kind of aggressive, clever financial maneuver I had taught him to execute myself. It sounded bulletproof. I see, I murmured, staring blankly at the gray grout between the dirty bathroom tiles. I was going to walk you through it when you got back, Preston said. You're supposed to be relaxing. Right now, Dad. Let me handle the heavy lifting. The lie was seamless, wrapped in the warm cloak of a caring son. The line went dead. You know how she is, Dad. I sat alone in the quiet bathroom stall, holding the phone against my ear. You know how she is, Dad? I was almost ready to believe his logical explanation. But something in my gut pushed back. I lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen. My heart hammered in my chest, reacting to the sheer weight of the emotional disaster unfolding right inside that cold stall. The restroom was dead silent, except for a broken faucet dripping rhythmically somewhere down the row. You know how she is, Dad. My reflection in the stainless steel dispenser looked pale and exhausted. Preston had sounded so convincing. He used the exact, precise business terminology I had taught him over the years. He maintained a steady, reassuring pace. Anyone else would have walked out of that stall, boarded the plane, you know how she is, and comfortably sipped champagne for the next 20 hours. But I wasn't just anyone. You know how she is, Dad? I was the man who built the company he was currently running, and my son had made one critical, careless mistake. You know how she is. Silverstone Plaza wasn't a deadweight project waiting for a strategic tax write-off. Silverstone Plaza had been completely liquidated 4 months ago. I knew that for a fact because I personally signed the closing documents right before handing over daily operations to him. I negotiated the deal myself in late February, selling that parcel to a logistics firm. The money from that sale was sitting safely in our accounts, recorded clearly on our quarterly earnings report. There was no debt left to transfer. There was no need no need for a subsidiary. My son had just lied to my face with the easy skills of an experienced predator. Dad. He took a piece of past real estate history and twisted it into a convenient cover story, assuming my memory was fading with age. Believing I truly was the confused old man, he mocked on the phone to his accomplice. The cold, heavy knot in my stomach tightened until it felt like solid ice. You know how she is, Dad. This betrayal was no longer a terrifying possibility whispered by a stranger. It was a tangible, undeniable reality. I needed to know how far the damage had already spread. I am in debt. If Preston was lying about moving debt, what else was he manipulating behind the closed doors of our executive suites? My hand shook so badly, I almost dropped the phone into banking app. I unlocked the screen and opened my personal banking app. I bypassed the corporate accounts entirely and logged directly into my private retirement trust. This was a heavily protected independent fund, completely separate from the main company umbrella, holding the vast majority of my personal liquid assets. It was from 40 years of the main's company assets. It was the vast majority of my perflace liquid built. It was the Fally safety net built from 40 years of relentless work and sacrifice. I entered my security password and waited for the loading screen to clear. The familiar blue dashboard didn't show up. Instead, the screen went completely white. "You know how she is, Dad," and a stark red notice popped up in the center. Access denied. Legal freeze in effect. Contact your branch administrator immediately. I stared at the words until they blurred. Access denied. Legal freeze. "You know how she is." The air in the cram-up stall suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I couldn't get enough oxygen into my lungs. A legal freeze on a private trust of that size wasn't a simple paperwork error. It was a catastrophic, highly coordinated financial strike. It required of forged evidence submitted to a federal judge. And mountains. Preston hadn't just made a few unauthorized transfers. While I was busy packing for a vacation he planned, he was fundamentally dismantling the foundation of my entire financial life. He used my complete trust in him as the ultimate weapon. He turned my desire to step back and enjoy my final years into his greatest advantage. Every warm smile, every reassuring pat on the back, every time he told me, "You deserve to relax," it was all a calculated performance. He'd left ornaments. He had been poisoning the well, setting all the parameters in place, waiting for the exact moment I disappeared from the picture to freeze my assets. The security guard had been dead right. If I had gotten on that flight to Cambodia, I would have been stuck in a foreign jungle, completely broke, unable to fight back, while my son systematically stripped my empire down to the bone. In a crisis, panic is a useless emotion. In a crisis, I learned that lesson decades ago during a market crash that nearly destroyed my early business, that nearly destroyed Tuesday. You don't survive by freezing in place. You survive by moving forward. The scale of Preston's operation meant he had to be tracking my movements. If he had the resources to legally freeze as a heavily protected trust, he certainly had the means to monitor my mobile device. Every text I sent, every call I made, every location ping was a vulnerability. With a firm, decisive motion, I ripped the case off my phone. Pulling a small metal pen from my jacket pocket, I jammed the tip into the tiny side slot. The plastic SIM card popped out into my palm. The single connection to my old life, and the only way my son could track my location. I pinched the tiny chip between my thumb and index finger, pressing hard, until I felt the satisfying snap break in half. I dropped the pieces straight into the toilet and flushed them in half. I dropped the pieces straight into the toilet and flushed them away. For the first time in 40 years, the founder of Caldwell Commercial Properties had gone completely silent. I pushed open the stall door and walked back out into the bright, humming concourse. Luxury leather suitcase was still my luxury leather suitcase. Was Stu's with 3 weeks' worth of the restaurant's entrance, packed with 3 weeks' worth of expensive resort clothes, a high-end camera, and the naive illusions of a proud father looking forward to retirement. I didn't even look at it. I walked right past Dad. I walked right past it, leaving it abandoned on the polished tile floor. A suitcase meant predictable travel patterns, and I couldn't afford that risk. I blended into the dense morning crowd, keeping my head low and my pace steady. I didn't look back at the VIP terminal where my son had hugged me just 30 minutes earlier. Pushing through the heavy revolving doors, I stepped out into the biting Colorado wind. Taxis lined the curb, idling in a long row. I bypassed the main transport hub entirely, walking down the concrete sidewalk to put physical distance between myself and the terminal. I felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with deep grief. The man who woke up this morning looking forward to a peaceful retirement was dead. My son had buried him with his own hands, but the Fotstedt was very much alive. But the relentless spurter who flagged down a passing taxi, slid into the back seat, and Caldwell she was on, told the industrial outskirt toward the dusty, forgotten industrial outskirts of Denver. Tuesday, I was officially Dad. I was officially a ghost, and it was time to prepare for war. The taxi ride felt like a slow descent into an entirely different world. For decades, my view of Denver had been from the tinted windows of a chauffeured limousine or the panoramic glass walls of my top-floor executive suite. Now, I watched those gleaming skyscrapers fade away, replaced by cracked brick facades, graffiti-covered alleys, and rusted chain-link fences in neglected industrial zones. I had the driver pull up next to a rundown gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 1980s. You know how she is, Dad. I handed him a $50 bill and told him to keep the change. Walking into the dimly lit Dad, bypassed the dimly lit store, I passed the aisles of cheap snacks and went straight to the counter. I bought a prepaid burner phone along with the maximum allowed cash top-up cards for a single transaction. The bored clerk barely looked up from her magazine as I handed over a stack of 20s. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. Walking 3 blocks down the dusty road, I found exactly what I needed. A single story with a flickering neon sign offering hourly rates and free cable. The asphalt parking lot was cracked, with weeds pushing through the broken pavement. I stepped into the cramped lobby and paid for a room using the last bit of cash I had on, using the last bit of paper cash I had on me. The tired night clerk slid a heavy brass key across the scratched counter without asking for an ID. Room 7 was tucked away at the very back of the property, facing a tall, concrete retaining wall. I unlocked the door, and the stale smell of old smoke and cheap pine cleaner hit me immediately. The carpet was a faded brown, worn thin down the center. A sagging mattress rested against the wall under a thin polyester cover. I walked over to the small, scratched wooden desk and sat down on the creak metal fold. The folding chair, the proud founder of the billionaire of the Bullswood of the largest commercial real estate empire in the American West, reduced to staying in a $40 a night motel. No tailored suits, no security team, not either suits, no security team, not even a single piece of luggage to my name. I placed the cheap burner phone on the small wooden table and stared blankly at it. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. I needed a clear, concrete strategy, but to build one, I had to be completely honest about my vulnerabilities. My personal retirement trust was locked down under a fraudulent legal freeze. That meant Preston had likely contracts approved that she's my practicing Tuesbowl money Tues Preston, had likely infiltrated my highest level banking contacts across the country. If he managed to convince a judge to approve that freeze, he had to be holding a mountain of professionally forged documents. You know how she is. I couldn't just stroll into corporate headquarters tomorrow morning demanding answers from my executive team. I had no idea how deep this corruption went. Who could I even trust at this point? The board of directors? No. Preston spent the last 2 years wining and dining them at expensive steakhouses and taking them on luxury golf trips. You know how she is, Dad, charming every single one of them with his polished image. Legal? Absolutely not. Our general counsel was a young, ambitious lawyer, Preston, recruited personally 8 months ago. Anyone currently drawing a paycheck from Caldwell Commercial Properties was a potential risk. I was completely isolated. I rubbed my temples, feeling a sharp headache building behind my eyes. I know how she is. I needed someone who understood the deep, complex financial plumbing of my entire company. You know how she is, Dad. Someone who knew exactly how money moved through every subsidiary and hidden holding account. More importantly, I needed someone with absolute, unquestionable loyalty to me. You know how she is, Dad, and zero allegiance to my deceitful son. The sudden realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. You know how she is, Dad. The answer had been sitting right in front of me for an entire year. Diane. Diane was my chief financial officer. She was tough, intensely analytical, and had worked by my side for over 2 decades. We weathered the storm of the 2008 market crash together. She knew where every single dollar in my empire was buried. Yet, exactly 1 year ago, shortly after Preston was promoted to Chief Operating Officer, she abruptly announced her early retirement. At the time, sobbed. Preston told me she was suffering from severe burnout and wanted to spend more time with her grandkids in the quiet suburbs. He offered her a generous severance package, and she quietly packed up her desk and left. You know how she is, Dad. I believed his polished story completely. Now, sitting alone in the dim light of a cheap motel, the terrifying truth finally clicked into place. You know how she is, Dad. Diane didn't retire because of burnout. She was pushed out. You know how she is. Preston systematically removed the one person in the entire corporate hierarchy with the sharp intellect and direct access to catch his massive financial fraud. She was my only remaining hope. He'd laughed about it. I picked up the plastic burner phone and entered the activation code. Relying purely on memory, I prayed her personal cell number hadn't changed over the past 12 months. My awkward thumbs dialed the small keypad. I pressed send, held the device to my ear, and listened to the digital ringback tone. My stomach twisted into knots. What if she ignored unknown numbers? What if she had moved out of state? What if Preston had truly bought her silence forever with that massive payout? The phone rang 4 agonizing times. Just as I was about to give up, the line clicked open. Hello? Her voice was cautious, laced with suspicion toward an unlisted caller ID. Diane, I kept my voice as steady as humanly possible. It's Harrison. Harrison Caldwell. You know how she is, Dad. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to promise not to hang up this phone. A long, heavy silence stretched across the line. You know how she is, Dad, the kind of stillness that usually comes right before a disconnect. Then I heard a sharp, genuine gasp. Harrison, she sounded thoroughly shocked. Are you calling me from an unlisted number? Why do you sound like you're hiding in a closet? You know how she is, Dad. Aren't you supposed to be flying across the Pacific right now? I closed my eyes, a massive wave of relief washing over my exhausted body. She hadn't forgotten me. Diane. I didn't get on that plane, I said, my tone resolute. That trip was a trap. Preston froze my personal retirement trust. Know how she is, and I have reason to believe he is dismantling the company from the inside. I'm sitting in a cash-only motel. I have no access to my bank accounts, and I have no idea who else in the company is working for him. I need your help immediately. Another heavy pause hung on the line. When Diane spoke again, her voice turned sharp and businesslike. Give me an address, Harrison, she said. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I gave her the address of a run-down diner 2 miles away from the motel. It was a gritty spot illuminated by a flickering neon sign. The absolute last place anyone from Caldwell Commercial Properties headquarters would expect to find its founder. I braved the biting wind and walked over, taking a booth in the darkest corner. Exactly 28 minutes later, Diane walked through the door. Instead of her usual tailored business suits, she wore a simple, dark trench coat, blending into the bleak surroundings effortlessly. She slid into the torn vinyl booth across from me and placed a heavy canvas messenger bag on the table. We looked at each other in silence. She took in my pale face and the sheer desperation I was trying so hard to mask. You know how she is, Dad. I always knew this terrible day would come, she said quietly. I just prayed my instincts about him were wrong. I chin some sip of bitter coffee. I took a slow sip of bitter coffee. You knew Preston was planning something malicious? I asked, feeling a sharp pang of betrayal. Schultz eyes shook her head quickly. Specifics, Harrison? I didn't know the specifics, Harrison. I didn't know he would try to bankrupt you or freeze your personal assets, but I knew the company was being systematically hollowed out. A year ago, the company was being systematically hollowed out. Preston brought in an outside tech firm. He claimed it was a routine security upgrade, but the people leading entirely by Monica were brought in routine that entirely Monica? I repeated the name, feeling a surge of intense gust. My daughter-in-law was a well-known socialite. She had zero qualifications and no business interfering with the digital architecture of my real estate empire. Yes, Monica, Diane confirmed, leaning forward. She played the innocent wife, but she was running that entire tech team. You know how in less than 3 weeks, they completely firewalled the executive financial ledgers. You know how she is, Dad. They built a restricted digital environment that even I couldn't breach without daily authorization codes generated by Preston. When I started demanding answers, you know how she is, Dad, Preston called me into his office. He handed me a massive severance package and a strict non-disclosure agreement. He threatened to drain my retirement savings with endless litigation if I dared to tell you. He said you were stepping down anyway, and that he was steering the ship now. I closed my eyes tightly. How could I have been so willfully blind? I had allowed my own son to weaponize my company against my most loyal employee. You know how she is, Dad. But you didn't just walk away, I said, looking into her sharp eyes. You're too smart to just take a check and disappear. Diane offered a cold smile. She reached into her bag and pulled out an older model laptop. Of course I didn't. I knew they were locking the doors, so before they revoked my credentials, I left a window cracked open. Deep inside the legacy code of the HR portal, I planted a ghost account. It's a digital laughed about it. You know how she is. It's a digital backup buy that passes the central financial dashboard entirely. It gives us raw data feeds, enough to show where the money is moving. She opened the bulky plastic laptop, the machine letting out a loud hum. Pulling a mobile hotspot from her pocket, she connected to the network. The tension in the booth was thick. I watched her enter how she is, Dad, and after 3 agonizing minutes, the screen flashed. We're in, she whispered, turning the laptop toward me. The display was filled with endless columns of financial spreadsheets. This was the raw, beating heart of the company. Diane began filtering through the mountain of data with practiced precision. Look here. She pointed to a dense cluster of outgoing wire transfers. Preston restricted access to vendor names, but look at these staggering amounts. This is a catastrophic drain of liquid cash. Millions of dollars are being falsely classified as consulting fees and material purchases for closed months ago. I stared at the numbers. You know how she is. Add 700,000, 1.2 million, $3 million. The wealth I spent a lifetime building was washing out of the accounts like a raging waterfall. Where is the money going? I asked, my voice dropping to a raspy whisper. Can you trace? Shook her head in routing numbers. Diane shook her head in frustration. No. You know how she is? The digital trail hits a wall of heavy encryption the moment the funds clear the main holding accounts. Whoever Monica hired knew exactly how to scrub the digital footprints. To federal regulators, this just looks like standard corporate waste. We can't prove intentional fraud with these raw numbers alone. I leaned back against the vinyl seat. The situation felt completely hopeless. If we couldn't trace the money digitally, we couldn't legally prove Preston was deliberately sabotaging the empire. He could simply claim poor management, write off the losses, and walk away clean while I took the fall for the company's collapse. But we don't need to trace it digitally, Diane said suddenly. You know how her tone dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. Monica is arrogant, Dad. Monica is arrogant, Harrison, but she's also deeply paranoid. She would never trust digital encryption entirely. Right before they forced me out, I accidentally intercepted an email from her private architect. I frowned, completely puzzled. What does her private architect have to do with embezzling funds? Monica demanded the immediate installation of a military-grade biometric floor safe, Diane explained urgently. She insisted it had to be large enough to hold physical property deeds and financial ledgers. She kept paper copies of everything, Uger, Harrison. She wanted physical leverage, hands, heeds, systems SAP did her digital systems WAF failed, in case her digital systems failed. Enu, if we want to find out where your $40 million went and how they plan to frame you, we have to get our hands on what's inside that safe. My heart pounded against my ribs. Where on earth did she install a biometric safe? Diane took a deep breath, delivering the crushing blow. She had it installed in the master suite at the main estate. You know how she is, Dad. The blood drained from my face. The main estate. She was talking about my home. Mansion in the prestigious Cherry Creek neighborhood. 6 months ago, Preston convinced me to let him and Monica move into the main house, claiming their own home was undergoing mold remediation. I completely oblivious to their real quarters, completely oblivious to their real motives. You know how she is, Dad. Now I realize the whole mold story was just another calculated lie to get Monica inside my home so she could set up her base of operations. So you're telling me, I said, my voice trembling with controlled anger, that the evidence to save my company and my freedom is locked in a safe right in the middle of my own bedroom. You know how she is, Dad, while the two people trying to destroy me are sleeping in my bed? Diane gave a slow, solemn nod. I left Diane at the diner, promising to call her the moment I retrieved the documents. The drive back to Cherry Creek took 40 minutes. It was 2 a.m. A thick fog swallowed the streetlights, wrapping the sprawling estate in a gray haze. You know how she is, Dad. I parked the rental car 3 blocks away, hidden behind thick hedges, and approached the wrought iron gates of the estate. You know how she is, Dad. Slipping into my own home like a thief, a place I built from scratch, felt deeply unsettling. Preston had completely upgraded the perimeter security system 3 months ago. You know how she is, Dad, claiming the new sensors would provide better peace of mind. He was right, assuming I would never bypass it, but my son underestimated my meticulous nature. When the contractors installed the main panel, I secretly requested the master override codes from the lead technician. Preston had no idea those codes even existed. I stepped up to the digital keypad, hidden behind the stone pillar, at the side gate, hidden behind the stone pillar. Yeah. Safsk, he is, Dad. I entered the sequence, and the green indicator light flashed silently. The magnetic lock released. I stepped onto the manicured lawn of my estate, the towering silhouette of the mansion looming through the fog. Every window was dark, and the entire property was blanketed in dead silence. I moved carefully across the damp grass, avoiding the gravel paths to eliminate any crunching sounds, making my way toward the heavy French doors leading into the sunroom. You know how she is, Dad. I pulled a special keycard from my wallet. It was my personal pass, holding the highest authorization clearance from the old security framework. I prayed, Ballad. Monica hadn't purged my old credentials from the internal deadbolts. You know how she is, Dad. I slid the card into the slot, felt a faint mechanical hum, turned the brass handle, and stepped inside. The chill of the air conditioning hit me. You know how she is, Dad, carrying the familiar scent of polished mahogany. Yet the house felt completely foreign. The layout was the same, but the energy had shifted. You know how she is, Dad. I was a ghost, slipping into a life that belonged to me, yet had been stolen away. You know how she is, Menz? I moved slowly through the grand foyer, giving my eyes time to adapt to the shadows. I paused at the bottom of the dual staircase. Right above me, on the second floor, you know how she is. My son and his manipulative wife were sleeping comfortably in my bed. I could almost hear their breathing drifting down through the open space. The sheer boldness of their betrayal ignited a surge of anger in my chest. I wanted to storm up how she is, Dad, but venting anger without proof was exactly what they wanted me to do. I forced myself to focus on the task. Turning silently, I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the west wing. This area used to be my private study. When Monica moved in, she immediately claimed the space, tearing down my antique oak bookshelves and replacing them with modern glass display cases. It was now her command center. The heavy door to her remodeled home office was firmly closed. I pressed my ear against the cold wood. You know how she is, Dad, listening intently for the slightest sound inside. Absolute, tense silence. Dad. I gently turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. Moonlight spilled through the tall arched windows, bathing the room in a pale glow. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. My beloved study was jarring. The rich dark wood had been painted a lifeless white and industrial gray. You know how she is, Dad. A sleek glass desk sat right in the center of the room, completely devoid of paper. You know how she is. Monica was meticulous. She nevertheless exposed of, but Diane had warned me about her deep paranoia and her need for physical leverage. My eyes locked onto the far wall, where my prized first edition architecture books used to sit. A massive, abstract painting now hung. Chaotic, bold strokes of black and deep red crisscrossed the canvas. You know how she is, Dad, looking entirely out of place on the cold walls. In the entire room, this was the only object large enough to conceal a military-grade safe. I moved quickly across the room, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. You know how she is, and stopped right in front of the giant painting. It was heavy, set in a thick, brushed steel frame. I carefully ran my index finger along the bottom edge. You know how she is, Dad, searching desperately for a hidden latch. My fingertips brushed against a small recessed button, perfect concealed in the lower recessed, perfectly in the lower right corner. Taking a shaky breath to prepare myself, with a soft hydraulic hiss, the massive painting slid smoothly to the left along a hidden motorized track. My breath caught in my throat, embedded directly into the reinforced drywall was a gleaming, state-of-the-art biometric safe. It was much larger than I anticipated. The heavy steel door was matte black. You know how she is. Outfitted with a complex digital keypad, an advanced retina scanner, and a highly sensitive fingerprint reader. It looked like something pulled straight from a high-security government facility. This was the center of it all. You know how she is, Dad. Locked inside the vault was the complete blueprint for my financial destruction. Physical ledgers, forged bankruptcy filings, and offshore shadow accounts. Everything Preston and Monica were using to dismantle my legacy sat right in front of me, secured behind 2 inches of solid titanium. You know how she is, Dad. I stared at the blinking red light of the biometric scanner. While Diane had alerted me to the safe, neither of us had a plan to bypass a physical biometric lock. It required Monica's personal obviously didn't have. A cold wave of despair washed over me. Had I risked everything to break into my own home and slip past the traitors, only to be stopped cold by a piece of reinforced steel? Busy be cold by a Tuesday. I placed my hands flat against the cold metal door, searching desperately for any physical weakness. I closed my eyes tightly, forcing down the rising panic. I had to think logically. I had to recall everything I knew about my daughter-in-law. Monica was deeply paranoid, but she was also arrogant and predictable. You know how she is, Dad. She demanded total control over her environment and would never trust a digital machine entirely. She would have insisted on a physical master override. You know how she is, Dad, just in case the electronics ever failed. Dropping to my knees, I ran my hands frantically beneath the heavy glass desk. Nothing. I checked the sleek filing cabinets, pulling drawers open, and feeling along the back tracks. Still nothing. You know how she is, Dad. The digital clock read exactly 2:45 a.m. Time was running out fast. Every second I spent inside this house increased the chances of being caught exponentially. You know how she is, Dad. If Preston woke up or a motion sensor picked up a stray shadow, my plan would be completely over. I stood up and stared back at the imposing safe. You know how she is, Dad. I needed to find her master override, and I had to do it now. As I stared at the black steel door of the vault, my mind worked at top speed. I couldn't search the entire room for a physical key. For a physical key. That would take hours. I didn't have. I forced my breathing to slow down. I had to think like the man who built this estate. When I originally built this mansion, I hired a specialized security firm to install the internal grid. You know how she is, Dad. I had mandated that every electronic lock on the property feature a universal analog override, a deeply embedded digital sequence that could bypass all biometric scans. You know how she is. It was a fail-safe against catastrophic power outages. Monica had completely remodeled the office and updated the software, but this physical safe was hardwired directly into the house's original structural power grid. You know how she is, Dad. If she used the estate's original contractor, that underlying override code might still work. It was a gamble, but it was my only shot. I walked up to the digital keypad beneath the retina scanner. My fingers trembled. Taking a deep breath, you know how she is, Dad. I began typing the sequence, a complex 14-digit code based on the exact coordinates of my first commercial property, combined with Beatrice's date of birth. I pressed the final digit and held my breath. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The red scanner light kept blinking and my heart sank. But then, you know how she is, Dad. A sharp metallic click echoed through the room. The blinking red light turned solid green. With a heavy mechanical groan, the thick titanium deadbolts retracted. Grippy. I turned it down and pulled the door open. I turned it down and pulled the heavy door open. Tuesday. The interior of the vault was pitch black. Reaching into my jacket pocket, I pulled out a small LED pen light I had bought at the gas station. Dad. I clicked it on, sending a narrow beam of white light into the dark space. I had fully expected to see stacks of foreign currency. You know how she is, Dad. Velvet boxes filled with Monica's expensive jewelry, or offshore bank tokens. Instead, there were no valuables inside the massive safe at all. It was packed tight with thick, glossy legal folders. I reached inside and pulled out the top stack. The folders were heavy, the fold held together by thick rubber bands and marked with complex alphanumeric codes. Moving silently like a ghost, Dad, I carried the heavy bundle over to the glass desk and spread them out under the pale moonlight pouring through the high windows. I opened the first folder. How she is, Dad. It was a comprehensive commercial loan agreement. The heavy paper felt unnatural against my cold skin. I scanned the top of the document. The lender was a private equity firm operating out of the Cayman Islands, a shadow entity with zero identifiable corporate footprint. You know how she is, Dad. The primary loan amount was listed at $12 million. I felt a cold chill run across my skin. Caldwell commercial properties had strict internal policies regarding international debt. Our major development projects only used trusted domestic banking partners. I flipped through the thick pages of dense legal language, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted terms. This wasn't a standard corporate loan. It was a predatory, high-interest structure designed to aggressively drain the borrower dry. And that borrower wasn't the company. And that borrower, knew. I turned to the final signature page, and my blood ran cold. On the black line designated for the primary personal guarantor, there sat my name. It was an absolute, flawless copy of my handwriting, the unique loop of the H dollars, the sharp, aggressive slant of my last name. It was a precise, perfect forgery. You know how she is, Dad, but I had never seen this document in my life. My hands began to shake violently. I opened the second folder. Another loan agreement from a different shadow financial firm in Panama, this time for an astonishing $18 million. Once again, my forged signature rested on the bottom line, putting my personal name on the hook for the entire debt. I tore through the rest of the folders. There were dozens of them. 20 million, 15 million, 10 million. The horrifying reality of their plot hit me with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. Preston and Monica weren't just embezzling funds from the company. You know how she is, Dad. They were systematically taking out tens of millions of dollars in illegal, untraceable loans from dark market shadow organizations. They were using my name, my personal credit, and my lifelong reputation as the ultimate collateral. They were quietly, Dad. You know how she is, Dad? They were quietly funneling this massive wave of cash into their own hidden offshore accounts, while deliberately flooding my personal financial records with a catastrophic amount of toxic debt. When these loans inevitably defaulted, these shadow entities would use the legal system. These shadow entities would use the matrestum to seize my private retirement trust, my estate, and every single asset I had ever built to recover the funds that had simply vanished. Preston's conversation at the airport finally clicked into a complete, terrifying picture. He wasn't liquidating Silverstone Plaza. He wasn't lead Silverstone Plaza. He was using it as a smokescreen so that the moment I landed in Cambodia, he could trigger a holding the bag for total destruction. He intended to leave me holding the bag for total destruction while he and Monica vanished with hundreds of millions of dollars. I had to get these documents to Diane immediately. He'd laughed about it. This was absolute, undeniable proof of their corporate treason. I began shoving the heavy folders deep into the pockets of my trench coat, taking as many as I could carry without making a sound. Just as I reached for the last stack of forged agreements, a sudden sound shattered the silence of the house. You know how she is, Dad. It was the distinct, heavy creak of hardwood floorboards under pressure, coming from directly above my head. Someone was awake. You know how she is, Dad. Heavy footsteps began moving across the master bedroom toward the grand staircase. It was Preston. He was coming downstairs. Adrenaline flooded my system. You know how she is, Dad. I stuffed the final folder into my coat, spun around, and pushed the heavy steel door of the vault shut. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. It locked with a sharp click. I rushed to the large abstract painting, grabbed the brushed steel frame, and shoved it back along its hidden motorized track. Just as the footsteps reached the first landing of the stairs, the paintings slid back into place. He was likely coming down for a glass of water. I moved across the carpet and slipped out of the remodeled home office, shutting the door behind me and keeping the handle completely level. The grand foyer was shrouded in shadows. I could hear Preston humming a relaxed Imad tune as he walked huff through the kitchen. Moving like a shadow, I kept against the cold hallway wall. I kept my body pressed against the cold hallway. I reached the French doors of the sunroom, swiped my electronic keycard, and stepped out into the biting night air. Just as the bright kitchen lights clicked on inside, you know how she is, Dad. I gently closed the glass door. I was only seconds away from being discovered. I disappeared into the heavy fog, holding the heavy evidence of my son's ultimate betrayal tightly against my chest. You know how she is, Dad. The drive back to the motel was a blur. I parked the rental car 2 blocks away from the flickering neon sign. The night wind was sharp. You know how she is, Dad. But as I moved across the cracked asphalt toward room 7, I barely felt the cold. I knocked twice, paused, and knocked once more. The deadbolt clicked, and the heavy door opened. Diane stood there, her face lit by the harsh blue light of her laptop screen. She quickly ushered me inside and locked the door behind me. Without saying a word, I unbuttoned my coat, pulled out the thick legal folders, and tossed them onto the creaky mattress, Diane didn't ask how I bypassed the biometric vault. She grabbed the first stack and began rapidly scanning the pages, He'd laughed about it. For the next hour, the only sound in the dim motel room was the rhythmic flipping of heavy paper and the distant rumble of long-haul trucks on the highway. I paced back and forth in the narrow space between the bed and the scratched dresser, my chest tight with tension. Finally, Diane let out a long, shaky breath and took off her glasses. "It's worse than we thought, Harrison," she said, her voice dropping to a heavy whisper. "These aren't just unauthorized lines of credit. These are aggressive corporate execution orders." I stopped pacing and stood by the desk. "Walk me through it." Diane spread the documents across the faded brown bedspread. "You know how she is, Dad. Caldwell Commercial Properties is entirely profitable, Harrison. You know how she is, Dad. The company is generating massive margins. But over the last 8 months," he'd laughed about it, "Preston and Monica have systematically drained $40 million from our main operating accounts. They moved the cash through a maze of shell companies. How she is, Dad, disguising it as third-party contractor fees for Silverstone Plaza. But Silverstone was already liquidated. I countered, frustration leaking into my voice. Exactly. Diane nodded sharply. They used the closed project as a ghost ledger. Once the $40 million was pulled out. They filled the missing cash gap with these highly toxic and unregulated shadow loans. Because they forged your personal signature on every page, as legal liability as the sole guarantor, corporate legal liability is completely shielded. When these balloon payments default, the shadow lenders will instantly and legally seize your private retirement trust. The cold, calculating brilliance of the scheme was chilling. Preston was using my own life's work to destroy me. You know how she is, Dad. He and Monica would walk away with $40 million in untraceable cash, while I would be completely wiped out and facing a federal investigation over catastrophic loan defaults. We have these forged documents, I pointed at the bed. We have proof of their fraud. We can take this directly to federal authorities first thing in the morning. Diane shook her head, her expression grim. You know how she is, Dad. It's not enough, Harrison. Yes, we have paper contracts, but these shadow lenders are ghost entities. Without direct evidence showing where that $40 million actually went, Preston can easily argue that you authorized these high-risk loans yourself since your physical signature is on the page. You know how she is, Dad. We need to find the final destination of that stolen money. You know how she is, Dad. We need the actual communications linking them to those offshore accounts. I reached into my front trouser pocket. When I was pulling the folders out of the vault, my knuckles had brushed against something small and hard, tucked into the deepest corner of the steel shelf. I pulled it out and set it gently on the table next to Diane's laptop. It was a sleek silver USB drive. How she is. Diane stared at the small metal rectangle, hope instantly filling her eyes. Harrison, she whispered, tell me you found this inside Monica's biometric safe. It was hidden behind the last stack of loan agreements, I confirmed. Diane grabbed the drive and plugged it into the side port of her laptop. You know how she is, Dad. A prompt popped up on the screen, demanding a 32-character alphanumeric decryption key. The drive was heavily encrypted, locked behind military-grade security protocols. We're locked out. We're locked out, I said, a wave of bitter disappointment hitting me. We don't have her password. Diane offered a sharp, determined smile. You forget who you're dealing with, Harrison. I was the CFO of a billion-dollar commercial real estate empire. You know how she is. When Preston forced me out, I downloaded a complete archive of our internal network vulnerabilities. Monica thinks she's a digital ghost. You know how she is, Dad. But she made a very amateur mistake by linking her private encryption keys to her automated calendar reminders. Opening a separate terminal window, Diane began typing at a rapid speed. Lines of green code cascaded down the black screen. She ran a targeted extraction program, pulling fragmented data from the ghost account she had planted deep within the HR portal. A script, the encrypted Dad. She cross-referenced the encrypted drive with Monica's archived digital footprint, searching for the microflora firewall. For 20 agonizing minutes, you know how she is, Dad. The only sound in the motel room was the fast clatter of keys. I held my breath, staring at the monitor. Suddenly, the laptop emitted a soft, high-pitched chime. The black terminal window vanished. The desktop flashed, and a massive directory of neatly organized folders popped up. We were in. Diane clicked on the first folder labeled Offshore Communications. The screen immediately filled with hundreds of sensitive, unredacted emails. These were direct private messages between Monica and anonymous brokers managing shadow entities in Panama and the Cayman Islands. I leaned over Diane's shoulder, my eyes scanning the brutal, undeniable truth of my family's Betrayal. Fumrito. Is Dad. The emails detailed precise routing numbers, specific wire transfer agreements, and the complex digital laundering mechanisms used to clean the stolen $40 million. You know how she is, Dad. But what truly ignited a fire of pure rage in my chest was the arrogant tone in Monica's messages. I read a message she had sent to an offshore broker just 3 days ago. The subject line read simply, "Final stage." The email stated, "The old man suspects nothing. His head is completely filled with his precious legacy. Preston booked him a 3-week trip to Cambodia. The moment his flight leaves the tarmac, trigger the default clauses on the Panama loans immediately. Asset freezes should hit his private trust before he lands." You know how she is, Dad. How to make international call. His entire empire, how to make an international call. His entire empire will legally belong to us, and the 40 million will be permanently locked in Cayman accounts. You know she is. He will be completely broke and left to rot. I stared at the glowing screen, watching those words burn into my memory. The sheer cruelty. You know how she is, Dad. The absolute absence of human empathy or family loyalty was breathtaking. You know how she is, Dad. They wanted to strip away my dignity and leave me to decay in absolute poverty. Diane slowly closed the laptop screen. She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the fury boiling in my veins. "We have everything, Harrison," she said, her voice trembling. "We have the location of the stolen 40 million. I smiled slowly. Now it's time to bring them down. Diane didn't hesitate. Exiting, he'd put, Dad. Exiting the encrypted offshore mail client, she opened a new directory hidden deep within the shadow drive. The folder was named with a random string of alphanumeric characters, but the contents were entirely transparent. An extensive archive of chat logs exported from a secure messaging application. You know how she is, Dad. Running a decryption script from her ghost account, the garbled text reassembled into clear, readable conversations. She leaned closer to the monitor. You know how she is, Dad, her brow furrowed in concentration. Harrison, she murmured, her voice tight with disbelief. You need to see this right now. The emails were just the logistical instructions for the offshore transfers. You know how she is, Dad. These private chat logs are the actual strategic blueprint. I pulled the creaky metal chair closer to the scratched desk. You know how she is, Dad. Sitting side by side with her to read the glowing text. You know how she is. The chat logs documented an ongoing daily conversation over the past 8 months between a user handle tied directly to Monica's personal phone and a man identified only as Vargas. A quick background trace through an external corporate database revealed a detailed profile. Vargas was a corrupt, disbarred attorney operating out of Panama City. You know how she is, Dad. Known in international finance for orchestrating hostile corporate takeovers and laundering massive amounts of illicit wealth. He was an expert at making stolen money vanish into thin air. As I read through the thousands of digital lines exchanged over the last 8 months, the true hierarchy of this betrayal became painfully clear. Preston, despite his arrogance in the boardroom, his expensive custom suits, and his title, was merely the operational muscle. He was the inside man, using his position as chief operating officer to physically authorize the massive transfers and bypass our internal auditing protocols. Monica was the undisputed mastermind. She was actively undisputed mind, but she was actively pulling the strings from behind the scenes, directing Vargas and designing the complex maze of shadow holding companies. She was a master manipdad. She was a master manipulator, hiding a brilliant, ruthless mind behind the polished exterior of a wealthy socialite. My eyes scanned the glowing lines of text, tracking a specific conversation from just 48 hours prior. Strategic coordinations, the final strategic coordination before my scheduled departure for Cambodia. Monica's digital voice was completely devoid of human empathy or family affection. The sharp words jumped off the bright screen. Once the old fool gets on that 20-hour flight, lock down the domestic accounts immediately. She wrote. I read that cruel line twice, the harsh syllables tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. She didn't refer to me as her father-in-law, or even by my name. Just the old fool. Diane remained completely silent, her right hand trembling slightly as she scrolled down to the next block of text. Vargas had replied, asking for final confirmation on the upcoming media strategy. Monica's response was swift and precise. Leak the embezzlement news to the press right away. She ordered. Make sure financial reporters get the forged documents showing his personal signature on the massive shadow loans. The world will believe Harrison Caldwell stole from his own company and fled to Asia to avoid federal prosecution. My heart stopped, a terrifying split second. The staggerized in my exhausted mind, crystally, mind. You know how she is, Dad. They weren't just stealing $40 million. They were executing a complete, flawless character assassination. If I had boarded that plane unprepared, you know how she is, Dad. I would have landed in Cambodia with no working credit cards and no access to my wealth. But total financial ruin was only the beginning of the nightmare. I would have landed as a wanted international fugitive. You know how she is, Dad. By the time I connected to a local cell network, American news outlets would have been broadcasting my face on every major financial channel. Bold headlines would announce that the aging billionaire founder of Caldwell Commercial Properties had hollowed out his own company's vaults, forced the firm into bankruptcy, you know how she is, Dad, and fled to a non-extradition country to live out his days on stolen funds. You know how she is, Dad. The absolute cruelty of the master plan took my breath away. 40 years of my life had been dedicated to building this firm from a single rented desk into a towering corporate empire. 40 years of honest business deals. You know how she is, Dad. Generous, philanthropic endeavors, strong civic leadership, and an unblemished reputation. All planned to be violently burned to the ground before the sun rose tomorrow. I would be trapped in a foreign jungle, completely unable to legally defend myself, while my name became synonymous with corporate greed and cowardice. I stared at the glowing laptop screen, my head spinning from the realization. Why take such extreme, destructive measures? Why not simply steal the $40 million and walk away quietly? The answer was pure, unadulterated greed and a thirst for absolute power. By framing me as a fleeing criminal, laughed about it. Monica and Preston could step smoothly into the public spotlight as tragic, heroic successors. They could play the innocent victims in front of the national media. You know how she is, Dad, promising to save the damaged firm from the smoking ruins left by my supposed breakdown. They would take complete control of the remaining corporate assets, write off the stolen millions as my personal theft. You know how she is, Dad, and emerge as the ultimate saviors of the Caldwell legacy. Diane typed rapidly. You know how she is, executing a series of commands to securely download and lock down the chat logs onto her own encrypted hard drive. She looked up at me, her brown eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the monitor. They are complete monsters, Harrison, she whispered, her voice filled with deep disgust. They didn't just want to rob you blind. They wanted to humiliate you. Dad, They wanted to erase your legacy entirely and rewrite you into history as the villain. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had carried heavy bricks on my earliest construction sites and drawn blueprints late into the night. You know how she is. They were surprisingly steady now. The initial shock and paralyzing tremors of family betrayal were gone. You know how she is, Dad. The deep heartbreak of realizing my only son was a willing traitor was swiftly replaced by an icy steel resolve. You know how she is, Dad. This was no longer a simple family dispute or a tragic corporate misunderstanding. This was a calculated, lethal declaration of war against my life, my freedom, and my good name. I took a deep, focused breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. The heavy emotional fog cleared completely and definitively. I watched Diane turn her attention back to the glowing screen, the sharp light illuminating the intense lines of concentration on her face. To destroy them completely, we needed to undo the entire foundation of their operation. We had the chat logs and the forged loan agreements, but a major piece of the puzzle was still missing. Legitimate private equity firms, even those operating in offshore, aggressively lend tens of millions of dollars to a real estate firm without conducting rigorous corporate audits. They would never accept a single personal guarantor without face-to-face verification. Diane began tracking the initial source verification. Tracking the initial source of the funds. Diane began tracking the initial source of the funds. He'd laughed about it, isolating the routing numbers from the Panamanian shadow lender. She fed them into a global tracking matrix. Sitting in the dim motel room, we watched the digital map jump across continents. The funds moved through a dizzying maze of digital wallets, bouncing from Europe to the Caribbean to South America. But Diane was relentless, peeling back the layers of encryption one by one to find the original point of origin. After 30 minutes of intense digital tracing, the matrix stopped spinning. A single location flashed on the screen. It wasn't an international banking center. It was Las Vegas, Nevada. I stared at the blinking red dot on the map. You know how she is, Dad. In the context of international commercial real estate financing, Las Vegas made no sense at all. I asked Diane to dig deeper into the specific holding company that initiated the transfer. Using the clearance she still retained, you know how she is. She ran the corporate registration through a restricted federal database. The result appeared on the screen in stark, undeniable terms. That entity wasn't a bank or a hedge fund. It was a well-known front company for an organized, violent, underground credit syndicate. You know how she is, Dad. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. My son had just come of money. You know how she is, Dad. My son hadn't just borrowed money from aggressive venture capitalists. He was taking tens of millions of dollars from an organized criminal syndicate. The sheer stupidity of it was impossible to fathom. I had raised this boy, giving him every conceivable advantage. He attended the finest business schools and inherited a seat at the board of a billion-dollar empire. There was absolutely no logical reason, a dangerous reason for him to seek financing's criminal syndicate operating out of the Nevada desert. There has to be a motive, I told Diane, keeping my voice low and steady to hide the rising tension in my chest. Preston had access to legitimate capital. He had a massive corporate salary. He didn't need shadow loans. Check where his personal money went. Diane nodded, opening a new search window. Using the apps about it, access codes extracted from Monica's decrypted files, Using the access security systems, she bypassed the security Preston's private digital accounts and began dissecting his financial 3 years debts, and began the tasks of a brilliant corporate 3 years. The picture that emerged was not that of a brilliant corporate strategist, of a heavy gambler, but the desperate, chaotic ledger of a heavy gambler. During his frequent business trips to the West Coast, Preston hadn't been managing company operations. He had been spending weeks in undisclosed, exclusive underground casinos. You know how she is, Dad. Diane pulled up the transaction logs. My son had been losing money at a terrifying rate, burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single hand at high-stakes poker tables. When his personal bank accounts ran dry, he turned to the volatile cryptocurrency market, desperately trying to win back his massive losses. But the market crashed. You know how she is, Dad, and his heavily invested digital tokens lost nearly all their value overnight. Diane highlighted the final devastating total at the bottom of the spreadsheet. Preston had lost $20 million. He was completely broke. You know how she is, Dad. He wiped out his trust fund. He secretly sold his stocks. He had nothing left, and he owed $20 million to a cartel that accepted 0 apologies and no extension plans. I stared at that shocking number, feeling a sickening mixture of disgust, rage, and deep pity. The flawless custom suits, the expensive watches, the confident boardroom speeches, it was all a hollow shell. You know how she is, Dad. My son was a desperate, drowning man, completely crushed under a mountain of illegal debt. He backed himself into a corner, facing ruthless criminals who killed people over a fraction of that money. That's when Monica stepped in, Diane whispered, piecing together the horrifying reality. You know how she is, Dad. She didn't marry a billionaire heir. She married a massive financial trap. When the syndicate demanded their money, she realized her entire lavish lifestyle was about to collapse violently. So she engineered a way to use your empire to pay them back. You know how she is, Dad. The mechanics of the operation were cold and calculated. The syndicate didn't just want their $20 million back. They needed a secure, you know how she is, legitimate pipeline to clean their dirty cash. He'd laughed about it. Monica offered Caldwell Commercial Properties as the ultimate laundering tool. She and Preston fabricated the massive shadow loans. Under the guise of commercial project financing, the cartel injected their dark money into my firm. Monica then structured the outgoing payments as fake consulting fees, washing the money through shell companies before routing it back to the cartel, with Preston's massive debt conveniently cleared as part of the deal. They were using tens of millions back to the cartel. They were using my flawless corporate infrastructure to launder tens of millions of dollars for organized crime. To completely shield themselves from inevitable federal scrutiny, they forged my signature on every single document. They were actively feeding my entire life's work to the wolves just to settle a blood debt. This revelation fundamentally altered my survival map. I was no longer just fighting a greedy son and a sociopathic daughter-in-law. I was caught squarely in the crosshairs of a violent cartel. If I simply walked into a police station to report the fraud, you know how she is, Dad, the syndicate would realize their laundry machine was compromised. They wouldn't wait for a long federal trial. They would sever all loose ends, wiping out Preston, Monica, you know how she is, Dad, and me, long before authorities could file a preliminary indictment. We can't take this straight to the federal authorities, Diane said, voicing my exact thought. She looked pale, reflecting the true danger of our situation. If the cartel senses an investigation, they will eliminate everyone involved. We're dealing with people who make corporate executives. She was entirely permanently. She was entirely right. You know how she is, Dad. Standard legal channels were useless. A simple police report was a literal death warrant. If I wanted to survive this crisis, reclaim my company, and keep my life, I had to be smarter, faster, and far more ruthless than the criminals sitting in my boardroom. How she is, Dad. I stood up from the creaky metal chair and began pacing the narrow space of the motel room. The walls felt like they were closing in. I had 48 hours for the cartel triggered a massive loan default. 48 hours. Before the international press branded me a cowardly fugitive. 48 hours. To dismantle an operation designed by sociopaths and funded by organized crime. I stopped pacing and turned to Diane. We cut off the head of the snake, I told her. We cut off the head of the snake, Wang Bo, stold, my voice completely stripped of any lingering paternal warmth. We don't go to the police, and we don't confront the cartel directly, but we can sever their access to the funds. If we smash the laundry machine, Preston and Monica have absolutely nothing left to offer them. Diane looked at me, her sharp mind already processing the logical demands behind my drastic proposal. You want to sabotage your own company? She asked, her voice laced with awe and fear. I'm going to burn their digital infrastructure to ashes, I answered, staring at the glowing laptop screen. I'm draining those holding accounts, wiping the ghost ledgers, and who are completely shattering their ability to transfer for a single dime. I'm going to force them to face the cartel empty-handed. And I need you to help me pull the trigger. Diane stared at me for a long moment. She gave a slow nod and returned her hands to the keyboard. You know how she is, Dad. If we do this, Harrison, there is no turning back, she warned softly. I stood behind her, watching the green cursor blink on the black terminal screen. There was no turning back the second they forged my name, I replied. Do it. Diane initiated a series of aggressive financial override protocols. He laughed about it. Because of Monica's intense arrogance, she linked the offshore shadow accounts directly to the central ledger for seamless transfers. You know how she is, Dad. Using the biometric master password I retrieved from the physical safe, Diane validated her access credentials. In just 14 minutes, she is, Dad. She breached the secondary firewalls. We're in the Panama holding accounts, she announced, her fingers flying across the keys. I see $40 million sitting in a volatile offshore trust. Drain it, I commanded. Route every single penny back into the primary domestic corporate treasury. Mark the incoming wire as a secure owl to trigger a federal anonymous public injection, to trigger a federal banking audit delay. That will lock the funds in a mandatory 72-hour hold. The cartel won't be able to touch it, and Preston will have zero access to the cash. Diane typed in the complex routing numbers. A progress bar popped up on the screen. You know how she is, Dad, and the tension in the room grew suffocatingly thick. The percentage climbed slowly. 10%, 40%, 80%. Finally, a bright green confirmation box flashed. You know how she is, the money is gone, Diane whispered, letting out a long, shaky breath. You know how she is, Dad. The offshore accounts are completely empty. The shadow lenders have zero capital left in those specific wallets. Now, I leaned closer to the monitor. You know how she is, Dad. Destroy the digital paper trail. Wipe the ghost ledgers completely from the internal servers. Disguise it as a catastrophic database failure limited strictly to the Silverstone Plaza project files. Diane executed the targeted data wipe. We watched months of carefully engineered fraudulent records vanish into the digital void. You know how she is. We successfully severed the connection between the cartel's cash and my legitimate company. Preston and Monica were now left with massive debts. Zero how she was, Dad. Zero corporate collateral and no stolen money to pay it back. They were completely exposed. The digital clock on the nightstand read 5:30 a.m. You know how she is, Dad. The sun was beginning to rise, cast a pale gray light through the motel blinds. My scheduled flight to Cambodia was set to take off in 2 hours. Preston and Monica were likely awake by now, expecting confirmation that I was on the plane so they could trigger their trap. You know how she is, Dad. I gathered the physical loan agreements from the bed and packed them into my leather briefcase. I turned to Diane. I'm going back to the house, I told her calmly. Diane looked at me with genuine concern. Harrison, they are desperate. If they figure out what you've done, things could turn hostile. I shook my head and buttoned my trench coat. They are cowards, Diane. They operate in the shadows because they are terrified of the light. Now, it's time to turn the lights on. As morning traffic began to build, I drove back to the Cherry Creek estate. The neighborhood was quiet and pristine. I parked my car directly in the circular driveway, abandoning any attempt at stealth. I walked up the marble steps and, scent of fresh espresso drifted through the house. They were awake. The scents. They were. Without hesitation, I walked straight into the formal dining room. Preston and Monica were sitting at the long mahogany table. Preston wore a crisp white bathrobe, sipping coffee while scrolling through a tablet. Monica was typing rapidly on her phone, completely absorbed in her digital world. The moment I stepped into the room, both of them froze. The color drained from my son's face instantly. The tablet clattered out of his hand onto the table. Dad, he stammered, his voice cracking. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at the airport. Your flight to Asia leaves in less than an hour. I pulled out a heavy dining chair and sat down at the head of the table, placing my heavy leather briefcase on the polished wood. You know how she is, Dad. I decided to cancel my trip, I said, my voice dangerously quiet and completely steady. Man, I realized there were urgent company matters that required my immediate personal attention. Monica slowly lowered her phone. Her manicured hands trembled slightly. You know how she is, Dad. What company matters, Harrison? She asked, desperately trying to maintain her polished composure. Everything is running smoothly under Preston's management. You have nothing to worry about. I unlatched my briefs, pulled out the thick stack of forged loan agreements, and tossed them into the center of the table. The documents hit the wood with a heavy, decisive thud. I'm worried, you know how she is, Dad. I'm worried about a $20 million illicit shadow loan from a Panamanian credit syndicate, I answered, looking directly into her fearful eyes. And I'm particularly concerned that my signature was flawlessly forged on every single page as the sole guarantor. Preston flinched hard, as if I had struck him. He stared at the documents, then at Monica, falling into absolute suffocating panic. Monica opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her arrogant, calculating demeanor vanished entirely. I also reviewed your private offshore communications this morning, I continued, letting the silence stretch between them. You know how she are, Dad. I read your plan to freeze my domestic accounts and leak false embezzlement stories to the press. I know everything about Vargas. You know how she is, Dad. I know about the underground casinos in Las Vegas. I know you lost $20 million of cartel money, Preston. Preston buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, broken sob. Dad, please, he begged, his voice muffled by his trembling fingers. They're going to kill me. I had no choice. I needed the company to wash that money. You always had a choice, I stated, coldly, feeling zero pity for the weeping man across from me. You chose to frame your own father. You chose to feed my life's work to mobsters just to save your own neck. Monica stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. This is ridiculous, she yelled, her voice sharp with rising hysteria. We can initiate the wire transfers right now. We can settle the debt and leave. You can't stop the digital protocols, Cascult, Harrison. The money is already programmed to move. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Monica, I told her. You know how she is, Dad. The offshore holding accounts are empty. Before the sun came up today, I drained every single penny of that $40 million and routed it back into a secure, federally monitored corporate treasury. You know how. I also wiped your ghost ledgers from the internal servers. Your laundry machine is broken. Monica staggered backward, gripping the edge of the table to keep her balance. You drained the accounts? She whispered in pure horror. You know how she is. The credit syndicate expects their first balloon payment by noon today. If the money doesn't clear, they'll come for us. They'll kill us both. Sounds like a personal problem. You know how she is, Dad, I replied, picking up my briefcase and standing from the table. I suggest you start packing. Authorities have been notified regarding the forged documents. You know how she is, Dad. The police are on their way to remove you from my property. You know how she is, Dad. You have exactly 10 minutes to get out of my house before they arrive. Preston looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Dad, you can't just leave us to the syndicate. We're family. You have to help us. I looked down at the son I had raised, the boy I gave the world to. Family protects each other, Preston, I said softly. You know how she is, Dad. Family doesn't forge signatures or orchestrate downfalls. You are no longer my son. You're just a criminal who took a terrible gamble and lost everything. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room, leaving them completely alone to face the devastating consequences of their consequences of their greed. I walked out into the crisp morning air and pulled the heavy front door shut behind me. You know how she is, Dad. The dull thud echoed down the circular driveway, marking a decisive end to my family life. I walked to the rental car, my posture straight and my face set like stone. I didn't look back at the grand estate I built. I slid into the leather driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away from Cherry Creek. I drove aimlessly for several miles, navigating the awakening city streets without a destination in mind. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the empty parking lot of a rundown diner, the exact spot where I had met Diane earlier. I turned off the engine. The quiet inside the car wrapped around me. The car wrapped around Diner as the surge of adrenaline finally began to fade. The Nujamal finally began to fade. The full reality of what had transpired crashed down on my chest. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. But a raspy sob tore through my throat, a sound I barely recognized as my own. I cried for the little boy who used to ride on my shoulders. I cried for the father who had smiled proudly at college graduations. Tuesday. I cried for the beautiful illusion of a loving family I had fought so hard to protect. It was a visceral, agonizing morning. Inside that quiet car, the man who was simply completely buried under a mountain of forged signatures, cartel, hot debts, and unthinkable betrayal. I let the hot flow freely, mourning the loss of my only son. Mourning the loss of my only son. You know how she is, Dad. The innocent child who used to look up at me with absolute trust had truly died the moment he decided to forge my name. He was gone. You know how she is, Dad. Replaced by a cowardly stranger who was ready to lead me to slaughter. For 20 minutes, I allowed that profound heartbreak to take its natural course. You know how she is, Dad. I allowed the raw pain to wash over me completely, clearing away any remaining pathetic shreds of false denial. But as the morning sun broke over the horizon, casting sharp light through the windshield, the tears stopped. That deep, agonizing sadness began to burn away rapidly. You know how she is, Dad, replaced by an icy absolute clarity that settled into my mind, the grief calcified into pure, unadulterated rage. You know how she is, Dad. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stared at myself in the rearview mirror. You know how she is. The broken, heartsick father was gone permanently. Looking back at me from the mirror was the cold, calculating architect of Caldwell Commercial Properties, the man who had crushed fierce competitors, navigated brutal market crashes. You know how she is, Dad, and built a billion empire from a single desk. Preston had severely underestimated Evertamid, the man who gave him everything. He assumed my aging equaled weakness. You know how she is, Dad. He mistook my patience as a father for complacency as a businessman. He forgot who he was dealing with. I was not a fragile old man waiting to be pushed into the shadows. You know how she is, Dad. I was the undisputed apex predator of my industry, and my company was facing a direct, hostile attack. You know how she is, Dad. I refused to surrender and let two greedy amateurs steal the legacy I sacrificed my life to build. I started the engine and drove straight back to the motel. The drive felt entirely different now. Every movement was precise, every thought sharply focused on total survival. When I walked back into room 7, Diane at the scratch desk, halter filled with deep scorn. Are you all right? She asked cautiously. Arvinger of the hardened lines on my face. I've never been better, I replied, my voice carrying the crisp, authoritative tone of a CEO entering a boardroom. The family ties are cut. Preston and Monica are entirely on their own. Now, we hold the line and execute a total counterstrike. Diane straightened up visibly, recognizing the fundamental shift in my demeanor. The CEO was back. What are your orders? Harrison? She asked, her fingers hovering above the laptop keyboard. We need to legally and publicly dismantle Preston completely, I instructed. You know how she is, Dad, pacing the narrow floor with a formidable new energy. The syndicate will target him because he lost their money. You know how she is, Dad, but we must ensure complete separation between myself and his toxic fallout. First, compile a comprehensive, irrefutable dossier on his embezzlement. I want every forged signature, every fraudulent shadow loan agreement. You know how she is, Dad, and every encrypted digital communication between Monica and Vargas organized flawlessly. We are delivering this dossier directly to the FBI, the SEC. You know how she is, Dan, your financial media outlets simultaneously. We control the narrative from minute 1. Diane nodded firmly, pulling up the decrypted files. What about the domestic corporate accounts? She asked. Initiate a complete corporate lockdown immediately, I ordered. Contact our primary domestic banking partners. Use my founder master credentials to freeze all executive operating accounts. You know how she is, Dad. I want Preston physically locked out of the building. Send emergency directives to corporate security. His access cards are revoked. His executive authority is terminated. You know how she is, Dad, and he is banned from setting foot on any Caldwell property. I want him isolated, desperate, and cut off from my resources. I pulled out the creaking motel chair and sat next to Diane, watching her execute the orders with ruthless efficiency. We were finally purging the infection. Draft a formal how she is, Dad. Draft a formal, hard-hitting press release scheduled for public distribution at exactly noon today. State that Caldwell Commercial Properties has uncovered a massive, unauthorized financial scheme orchestrated by a rogue executive. Announce my immediate return from retirement to resume my position as CEO. He'd laughed about it, Uraz, Dad. Reassure assets Happers remain untouched and profitable, and offer total transparency to federal regulators. Diane typed rapidly, her eyes reflecting the tactical light of the plan. By publicly exposing Preston as a rogue, bad actor, we instantly severed the syndicate's leverage over the company. The federal spotlight would act as a shield against physical retaliation. If federal authorities were scouring the financial ledgers, the syndicate couldn't use Caldwell as a laundry machine. Preston would be left standing in the crosshairs alone, buried under $20 million in debt with zero protection. He thought he could outsmart the man who built the ground he stood on. How she is, Dad. He thought he could steal my legacy and frame me for his colossal failures. I reached firmly for my phone, prepared to make the necessary emergency calls to my board members. The deep emotional pain of losing a son was a heavy, crushing burden, but the absolute necessity of survival demanded total, unwavering focus. You know how she is, Dad. I built an empire with my own hands, and I was fully prepared to burn my own blood to ashes to protect it. The temporary war room went into full operation. The legal strategy was locked in, and the complete destruction of those who betrayed me became merely a matter of a rapidly ticking clock. How she is, Dad? I didn't waste a single second indulging in the anticipation of revenge. Revenge was a chaotic, emotional impulse, whereas I required absolute surgical precision. Diane and I spent the next 3 hours meticulously compiling the digital files, printing every how she is, Dad, printing every unredacted chat log, and indexing the physical loan agreements I retrieved from Monica's biometric safe. We packed everything into 2 heavy, reinforced briefcases. The morning sun was fully up now, casting bright light into the dim motel room, but my mind remained remarkably clear. Picking up my burner phone, I dialed the direct emergency number of a corporate attorney I had retained for decades, a man with deep connections inside the federal government. Dad, I briefly explained the massive gravity of the situation, emphasizing the involvement of an underground credit syndicate. He grasped the catastrophic severity instantly. You know how she is, Dad. In less than 40 minutes, he arranged an emergency, off-the-record briefing inside a heavily secured federal building in downtown Denver. We left the motel without looking back. Did, lad? Diane drove my rental car while I sat in the passenger seat, my hands resting firmly on the briefcases. The drive into the city was tense, dominated by a heavy, profound silence. The explosive evidence in our hands was enough to bring down a billion-dollar firm and send my own flesh and blood to prison for the rest of his life. Hidudu, pleasant. We pulled into the underground parking lot of the secure federal plaza. My attorney was already waiting by the private service elevator. Skipping empty pleasantries and fake comfort, he scanned his security credentials, and we ascended together to a restricted floor dedicated to financial operations, to financial crimes, and organized syndicate operations. Fumen time tazuming toration. We were escorted into a stark, windowless conference room equipped with advanced recording technology and sterile fluorescent lighting. You know how she is. Bull people waited for us around a long steel table. 2 senior FBI agents specializing in complex corporate extortion. You know how she is, Dad. And 3 officials from FinCEN, federal experts trained specifically to track international money laundering operations. They observed me with a mix of intense scrutiny and professional skepticism, assuming I was a cornered, guilt-ridden billionaire trying to negotiate a favorable plea deal. I gave them no room for assumptions. Sitting down, I unlatched the heavy briefcases and spread the physical documents across the center of the table. I placed the decrypted offshore chat logs right next to the forged Panamanian loan agreements. Without raising my voice or begging for leniency, I laid out the terrifying framework of my son's betrayal. I explained how she is. Explained how Preston used his position as COO to systematically drain $40 million from Caldwell commercial properties, detailing his disastrous gambling losses in Las Vegas and the violent cartel he fell indebted to. I then directed their attention to the digital logs, exposing Monica as the calculating mastermind who engineered the laundering machine projects to move illicit funds through our ghost domestic projects. The federal agents listened in stunned silence. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering, even to seasoned investigators. When the lead FBI agent finally picked up the paper loan documents, his eyes narrowed sharply at the signature line. He looked at me, questioning my direct involvement. I immediately handed him an independent, digitally certified handwriting analysis report extracted from our legacy that the signatures on corporate archives by Diane, proving conclusively that the signatures on the illegal loans were meticulous, highly detailed forgeries. The heavy atmosphere in the sterile room shifted dramatically and permanently. The agents no longer viewed me as a potential suspect. They now saw a highly cooperative, invaluable victim who had handed them the master key to Dinsanul elusive international criminal operation. The FinCEN investigate numbers Diane extracted and fed them into their secure federal Secures Kiadasdend mainframe. Cruise. In under 10 minutes, they verified the exact digital path of the stolen money, confirming direct links to the Las Vegas syndicate. The lead prosecutor turned to my attorney, acknowledging the unprecedented value of the proactive evidence provided. You know how she is, Dad, because I brought the scheme to light and secured irrefutable proof of forgery before the cartel could trigger a default. They offered me full, unconditional immunity. How she is, Dad? My firm would be shielded from asset forfeiture, and my personal legacy would remain intact. However, simple immunity wasn't enough for me. You know how she is, Dad. I needed the toxic elements completely and permanently purged from my life. Haha, Dorit. You know how she is, Dad. The federal agents quickly realized that Preston and Monica were completely unaware that their digital infrastructure had been breached. They still believed $40 million. They still believed safely in offshore holding accounts, awaiting the final scheduled transfer to the syndicate brokers. This presented a brilliant tactical opportunity. You know how she is, Dad. The lead FBI agent outlined a massive, coordinated trap. We would not alert Preston or Monica, allowing them to continue operating under a false sense of absolute security. You know how she is. The Federal Cyber Division would covertly monitor the compromised offshore accounts. We know how she is, Dad. Waiting for the precise moment the cartel brokers attempted to execute the massive withdrawal. It was a trap with no escape. The plan required my absolute silence. I had to let Preston believe his scheme was progressing smoothly, that I was blissfully unaware, wandering aimlessly in a foreign country while he was prepared to seize my empire. The federal agents instructed to see fathom my empire, vanish, perfected me, funnily trapped Onish into a federally protected be off-the-grid safe house into relentlessly until the trap closed. The safe house until the trap closed. Need how she is, Dad. They needed Preston and Monica inside their command center at my Cherry Creek estate, physically attempting to execute the final authorization. That desperate, you know how she is, Dad, that desperate final keystroke would serve as absolute, undeniable their direct, knowing involvement in cartel money laundering, providing federal agents with the exact legal backing on purges to raid the estate and arrest them both on federal racketeering charges. Without a moment's hesitation, I agreed to all terms. I watched as the federal agents carefully packed the forged documents and decrypted flash drives into secure evidence bags. You know how she is, Dad, taking ownership of the nightmare that had nearly destroyed my life. Standing up from the cold steel table, I shook hands with the lead investigator. The suffocating weight that had rested on my chest since I first uncovered the betrayal finally lifted. Diane and I walked out of the federal building together. We stepped into the warm afternoon sunlight. The war was no longer being fought in the shadows of a dim motel room. The full, overwhelming weight of the United States government was now actively pressing down on the two people who thought they could throw me away. Natu who cut it. Preston and Monica had built their arrogant house of cards. Preston and Monica had built a house of cards on the assumption that I was a weak, blind old man. Today, they were about to discover the devastating, inescapable cost of that fatal miscalculation. The transfer to the federal safe house was a blur of unmarked vehicles and secure underground parking garages. Diane and I were escorted into a sterile, windowless apartment located somewhere in the vast suburbs on the edge of the city. The space was instantly converted into a high-tech federal command center. Armed monitors monitored the perimeter, while cyber technicians set up rows of glowing monitors on a small dining table. You know how she is, Dad. For 3 agonizing days, we sat in absolute isolation, watching the digital trap slowly tighten. You know how she is, Dad. Agents had successfully tapped the primary surveillance feeds from my corporate headquarters and my Cherry Creek estate. You know how she is, Dad. We watched Preston and Zolka Plaga go about their days with sickening confidence, completely oblivious to the invisible federal net closing in around them. Friday evening finally arrived, and the atmosphere inside the small, safe house crackled with intense, suffocating tension. You know how she is. This was the exact night Preston and Monica had selected to stage their grand public performance. Tuesday. They were hosting a lavish corporate gala at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. An event funded entirely by my corporate treasury to the tune of $500,000. It was advertised as a summit to offer reassurances to our most elite investors and press contacts. The lead federal agent handed me a secure tablet streaming a live high-definition feed directly from the hotel ballroom. Covert agents had seamlessly infiltrated the catering staff and AV production crew. I stared at the vibrant screen, watching my son and his wife celebrate what they believed was the absolute peak of their victory. The grand ballroom was a sickening display of deep, unmatched corporate greed. Tall imported white orchids sat on every table. You know how she is, Dad. Tuxedoed waiters moved through the crowded room, carrying silver trays filled with crystal flutes of fine vintage champagne. A classical string quartet played soft, soothing melodies on a velvet-covered stage. It was a brilliant, flawless designed AFLAS production to project absolute stability, affluent stakeholders. To a room full of worried, affluent stakeholders. Monica held court near the main entrance, wearing a stunning custom black designer gown. She played the part of the grieving yet supportive daughter-in-law with terrifying perfection. I watched her place a manicured hand over her heart. Offering sad, rehearsed smiles to concerned investors who approached her. She wiped away non-existent tears, softly speaking of the tragic decline in my mental capacity. Her performance was chilling. She was a master manipulator, effortlessly twisting the narrative to completely isolate my legacy. Preston stood nearby, surrounded by aggressive financial journalists and anxious board members, wearing a dark charcoal suit. He looked every bit the reluctant yet heroic successor, stepping up to take the reins of a troubled empire. The sheer, unbridled arrogance radiating from his posture made me sick. He checked his expensive platinum watch frequently, convinced that at this very moment, "You know how she is, Dad," my international flight was making its final descent into the humid dark of Cambodia. He fully believed I was stepping off the plane blindly, "You know how she is," straight into the waiting hands of a ruthless credit syndicate. He thought his massive lethal problem was being permanently erased on the other side of the world. I watched him carelessly sip his champagne, completely unaware that every single move he made was being logged by federal agents. The lead investigator tapped my shoe, pointing to a secondary monitor displaying a complex digital map. "You know how she is, Dad." The cyber division had successfully isolated the offshore ping originating from the Las Vegas syndicate. The underground brokers were actively trying to initiate the withdrawal process from the shadow holding accounts. The digital trap was set. "You know how she is, Dad." We just needed Preston and Monica to officially trigger it. The ballroom lights suddenly dimmed, and a bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. The quiet chatter of the wealthy crowd quickly faded into total silence. Preston handed his empty champagne glass to a passing waiter and slowly walked up the carpeted steps. "You know how she is, Dad." Adjusting the microphone with a heavy, dramatic sigh, he looked out at the ocean of expectant faces. "You know how she is." Letting a perfectly timed moment of absolute quiet stretch across the massive room. "You know how she is." When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with fake grief. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his tone carrying a deep, painful reluctance. We brought you together because Caldwell Commercial Properties is facing an unprecedented, tragic crisis. You know how she is, Dad. It breaks my heart to stand before you today to announce a fundamental restructuring of our entire executive board." He paused, looking down at his hands playing the grieving son to absolute perfection. I watched the live stream from the cold safe house, feeling deep, bottomless about it. Feeling a deep, bottomless emptiness where my fatherly love used to be, where my fatherly love continued. As many of you know, my father built this company from nothing through the ballroom speakers, his voice echoing loudly through the ballroom speakers. You know how she is. But recently, his mental health began a severe and rapid decline. We tried desperately to manage his condition in private. But just yesterday, we uncovered a catastrophic breach of trust. My father abused his executive authority as founder, secretly transferring $40 million from our primary operating accounts into untraceable offshore holding companies. A loud, frantic gasp rippled through the crowd. Dense camera flashes erupted around the stage, drowning Preston in a sea of blinding white light. He raised his hands, pleading for calm. "I know this is incredibly difficult to hear," he said, his voice trembling with false emotion. "You know how she is, Dad. We believe my father has fled the country to avoid federal prosecution, abandoning his family and his legacy. But I assure you, this company will survive. My wife and I are stepping up to personally guarantee our core assets. We will navigate this dark storm. We will board dark storm and restore Caldwell commercial properties to its former glory. I promise you, absolute transparency and unwavering dedication." The sheer audacity of his speech took my breath away. He'd laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad." He was publicly branding me a coward and a thief while actively seeking applause from the very people he was robbing. Monica joined him on the brightly lit stage. "You know how she is, Dad," wrapping her arm around his waist in a show of deep, unified strength. Thunderous, supportive applause erupted throughout the hall. They were completely sold on this flawless, sickening deception. I stared at the tablet screen with an entirely expressionless face. Sitting next to me, Diane clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Shaking her head in disbelief as she whispered, "They actually think they won. They think they are completely untouchable. Sump about it." "You know how she is, Dad." I shifted my eyes away from the live feed toward the lead federal investigator standing near the heavy door. Receiving a silent, urgent transmission through his tactical earpiece, the senior investigator looked directly at me and gave a sharp, decisive nod. The offshore syndicate brokers had officially initiated the primary withdrawal protocol. The massive digital transfer required a final physical authorization from the primary account holders. Heil physical and authorization from the primary account holders. The entire conspiracy had reached its critical, undeniable flashpoint. "It is time," I said calmly to the lead federal agent. "Close the net right now." Pressing 2 fingers to his earpiece, the lead agent issued a decisive command to the tactical team lurking in the shadows. "Go." That single, brief syllable sounded the absolute end for my son. He'd laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad." I stood up from the folding chair in the safe house and smoothed the lapels of my dark suit. I was dressed for a solemn occasion. Standing beside me, Diane handed me my heavy wool coat, offering a tight, serious smile. "It's time to take back your empire, Harrison," she said softly. I thanked her, stepped of the sterile apartment and walked down to the waiting black SUV. "You know how she is, Dad." 2 armed agents escorted me into the spacious back seat. The drive back to downtown Denver was swift and silent. City lights blurred outside the tinted windows. "You know how she is," reflecting the calculated focus that had completely taken over my mind. I was no longer a grieving father. I was a man pushed to the edge. "How she is, Dad," and I was about to deliver full accountability with interest. "You know how she is, Dad." We pulled into the underground loading bay of the Ritz-Carlton. A dozen federal agents in dark suits and concealed earpieces were already moving with synchronized precision, securing the lower perimeter and sealing every exit from the grand ballroom above. The trap was locked down tight, leaving zero possibility of escape. "You know how she is, Dad." The lead agent guided me toward a private service elevator. "You know how she is, Dad." We rode up to the mezzanine level in complete silence. As the doors slid open, the air grew thick with the muffled sound of the lavish gala at the end of the hall. I could hear Preston's voice amplified through the massive sound system, echoing down the carpeted hallway as he reached the climax of his performance, vividly describing the heartbreak unforced left by a disgraced father, forced to clean up the wreckage left by disgraced father. I walked slowly down the hallway, my leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. He'd laughed too. How she is, Dad. Yet Fru, formidable, followed 3 paces behind, a quiet, formidable presence assuring that justice was about to be served. I stopped right outside the massive mahogany doors. I could hear wealthy investors murmuring in sympathy, and I could picture Monica standing right by his side, her flawless facade. Projecting her flawless facade. They were stolen spotlight. They were basking in the stolen spotlight, fully convinced they had executed a perfect corporate takeover. They believed I was shivering in fear somewhere across the world, waiting for ruthless enforcers to find me. The sheer arrogance of their assumption fueled my resolve. Placing my hands flat against the polished wood of the double doors, I took one final deep breath, letting a cold, absolute focus wash over me. Then, with massive force, you know how she is, Dad, I pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The doors slammed back against the interior walls with an explosive crash, instantly shattering the reverent atmosphere of the room. The loud noise echoed like a gunshot. The ocean of wealthy investors, board members, and eager financial journalists turned as one toward the back of the room. A suffocating silence descended on the massive space, heavy enough to crush stone. I stood motionless in the wide doorway. Oft stood motionless in the wide doorway. The bright light of the chandeliers of dark suit reflected off the spotless fabric of my dark suit. I didn't look like a defeated fugitive. I radiated absolute, undeniable authority. I was the true, undisputed patriarch of Caldwell Commercial Properties, back to claim my rightful place. My eyes locked onto the brightly lit stage. Preston froze at the podium, caught mid-gesture, wiping away a fake tear. His hand hovered. Dad. His hand hovered uselessly in the air, and all color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He swayed slightly, gripping the edges of the wooden lectern just to stay upright. Beside him, Monica let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure terror. Her confident, manipulative mask shattered into unfixable pieces. Her dark eyes widened in raw panic, staring directly at the man she truly believed she had permanently buried. I began a slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The crowd of elites parted automatically like frightened sheep. I didn't look at a single one of them. You know how she is, Dad, keeping my cold, unyielding gaze fixed entirely on the trembling figure on stage. You know how she is, Dad. The only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic click of my shoes on the floor. Every step was another nail driven into the coffin of their deceptive plot. You know how she is, Dad. Federal agents slipped quietly and efficiently into the room behind me, securing every exit door. You know how she is, Dad. I reached the carpeted steps leading to the main stage and walked up with steady, practiced grace. Preston was shaking uncontrollably. You know how she is, Dad. His breathing was fast and shallow. He looked like a trapped animal, realizing the cage had just snapped shut. I walked straight up to the podium, stepping directly into his space. He smelled of cold sweat and expensive cologne. Reaching out, I firmly took the microphone. You know how she is, Dad. Slowly and intentionally levering it from his trembling, sweaty fingers. He didn't even have the strength to resist. I looked at Monica, who was hyperventilating just 2 feet away, then turned to face the dead, silent room. I didn't run. Preston, I said, my voice rolling through the massive speakers with absolute clarity. I just took a short detour to reclaim what belongs to me. A massive, collective gasp of utter shock rippled through the room. You know how she is, Dad. I turned my head slightly, looking straight into my son's terrified, tear-filled eyes. I didn't go to Cambodia, I told him. keeping my tone low so only he and Monica could hear the finality in my words. I went straight to the FBI. Then I went to FinCEN. Before the sun even came up today, I drained those offshore accounts completely. The brokers tried to you know how she is, Dad? Tried to withdraw their money 30 minutes ago and found nothing. You are completely broke, Preston. And surrounded by federal agents. You played a dangerous job game with reckless people, and today you lost everything. Preston let out a pathetic, broken sob as his knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the stage. He collapsed, burying his face in his trembling hands as the reality of his total destruction crushed him. Monica screamed as tactical agents moved in swiftly from the custody to take them both into custody. I stood tall and firm, silently watching complete, uncompromising justice finally take place. The heavy doors in every corner of the ballroom burst open as more than 24 federal agents in dark tactical gear flooded the venue. Fuff about it. Bright chandelier light glinted off the bold letters on their vests. The speed of their entry sent a wave of panic through the room. Wealthy investors and reporters scrambled in shock, dropping champagne flutes that shattered on the marble floor. The string quartet cut out abruptly, replaced by the authoritative commands of investigators securing the perimeter muscle. Standing rigid at the edge of the stage, I watched the net close in inescapable reality. Lockings come the traitors in an inescapable reality. Monica was the first to break. Her socialite persona dissolved into raw desperation. Letting out a piercing scream that echoed across the room, she gathered her dress, tearing the fabric as she sprinted toward a back exit. She pushed past startled waiters and stumbled over overturned chairs in a pathetic attempt to flee. She didn't get far. You know how she is, Dad. 3 agents intercepted her before she reached the curtains, moving with practiced efficiency to secure her arms. Who she is, Dad? Monica screamed frantically, kicking her heels and sobbing as cold steel handcuffs locked around her wrists. The high society elite she had worked so hard to impress watched in stunned silence as she was escorted away, her makeup completely ruined by panicked tears. Preston didn't run. He couldn't. He didn't even have the strength to stand. My son remained curled up on the brightly lit stage. His tailored suit severely wrinkled and his breathing shallow. He looked completely hollowed out, stripped of the arrogance that had fueled his betrayal. As 2 agents approached the lectern to arrest him, Preston suddenly began crawling forward on his hands and knees. He crawled straight across the stage toward me, tears streaming down his pale face. Reaching out trembling hands, he grabbed frantically at the fabric of my trousers. "Dad, please?" He sobbed hysterically, his voice dropping into a pathetic wail that made me sick to my stomach. "You have to stop them. Tell them this is a huge mistake. Please, Dad. I'm your only son. We're blood. You can't let them take me away. I'll do whatever you want. I'll sign whatever you need. Just don't let them lock me up in federal prison. I'm your family." I looked down at the weeping creature crawling in my shadow. I felt nothing. The deep grief I had endured in that dark motel room had burned away, leaving only cold steel. I no longer how she is, Dad. I no longer saw a beloved son. I saw a dangerous threat who had willingly handed my life over to a ruthless cartel. I slowly leaned down, firmly unprying his trembling fingers from my clothes and setting his hands aside as if discarding a toxic hazard. I deliberately stepped back, creating an unbridgeable distance between us. The moment you put a price on my life, you stopped being my son, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that cut through his hysterical sobbing. You know how Dad, you chose the underground syndicate. You chose illegal money. You chose to forge my signature and send me to slaughter. Now, you know how she is, Dad. You have to face the absolute consequences of your choices. There is no corporate buyout saving you today, Preston. There is no miracle rescue. Tactical agents grabbed Preston's trembling shoulders, pulling his limp body up from the floor. He continued to cry hysterically, begging for mercy, but I turned my back on him. I watched with complete detachment as they secured his hands behind his back. He'd laughed about it. The Denver high society crowd watched in stunned silence as my former son and his treacherous wife were escorted through the center of the ballroom. The flashes of the financial press, originally invited to document my downfall, were now capturing at the humiliating, permanent ruin of Preston Caldwell. They were dragged out through the heavy mahogany. There were panicked cries fading down the hallway until there was total silence. The lead agent walked up to the stage, gave me a respectful nod, and signaled his team to clear the venue. The chaos finally passed, leaving a room filled with shaken investors and terrified executives. They stared at me with a mix of deep awe and absolute fear. They had just witnessed a swift corporate execution, and they were waiting to see where the axe would fall next. I slowly turned and walked back to the center of the stage under the spotlight, picking up the microphone Preston had dropped during his breakdown. Testing the sound. You know how she is, Dad. A sharp feedback tone instantly silenced any remaining whispers in the room. You know how she is, Dad. I looked out at the sea of pale faces, easily recognizing powerful bankers, real estate moguls, and media figures who just 10 minutes ago were ready to accept my downfall. You know how she is, Dad. Ladies and gentlemen, I began quietly, my voice projecting steady authority through the silent ballroom. I offer my sincere apologies for the dramatic interruption to your evening. You know how she is, Dad. As you can see, Caldwell Commercial Properties faced a severe internal threat. You know how she is, Dad. The two individuals you just saw escorted from this room orchestrated a complex financial plot. They actively attempted to exploit our corporate infrastructure to assist in an international money laundering scheme, and to ensure their control. You know how she is, Dad. They aggressively tried to eliminate me permanently. You know how she is, Dad. I paused intentionally, letting my gaze sweep across the shocked audience in the front row. But as you can clearly see, you know how she is, Dad. Recent reports regarding my mental decline were greatly exaggerated. I didn't flee the country. I actively cooperated with the FBI and FinCEN. I personally initiated a full lockdown of our corporate treasury, preserving every legitimate asset flawlessly. The illegal accounts have been neutralized. And the direct threat to this company has been surgically and permanently removed, shifted rapidly from sheer panic to profound respect. Grabbing the sides of the wooden lectern to pursue entire respect, I leaned forward slightly, delivering my ultimate to the entire commitment to the entire industry. I built this empire with my own hands, With my own hands, I declared, my voice resonating with unstoppable force. I built it on absolute stability, deep loyalty, and unyielding strength. Let tonight serve as a permanent warning to anyone who mistakenly believes this firm is vulnerable. Caldwell Commercial Properties is secure. Core operating margins remain exceptionally strong, and our financial future is flawless. I have officially resumed my rightful position as CEO, and I assure you all, we will move forward stronger, sharper, and more dominant than ever before. 6 months later. The dust from the scandals had completely settled at Caldwell Commercial Properties. The massive federal investigation concluded with absolute efficiency, and we purged federal efficiency, and we purged every trace of the fraudulent ledgers from our corporate network. Our legitimate investors, having witnessed an incredible display of proactive transparency, quickly rallied around us. I permanently appointed Diane as the new chief financial officer. She earned the position through her unmatched brilliance and absolute loyalty during our darkest hour. The corporate culture was completely transformed. We emerged leaner, far stronger, and infinitely resilient. The heavy weight of an impending betrayal no longer poisoned my daily operations. Sitting comfortably behind my massive oak desk, overlooking Denver's sprawling skyline, I felt a deep, absolute sense of control. But there was one final, necessary chapter that needed to be closed. Mazable. The federal sentencing had taken place 3 weeks earlier. You know how she is, Dad. Monica accepted a brutal plea deal, testifying extensively against the underground credit syndicate's brokers to secure a slightly reduced sentence. Preston desperately tried to negotiate a similar arrangement, but he had zero useful information left to trade. The cartel had kept him completely in the dark. You know how she is, Dad, using him as nothing more than a convenient, disposable idiot. You know how she is, Dad. He was sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal prison. Throughout the long legal proceedings, I ignored every frantic phone call he made and every desperate letter he sent. Today, I finally decided to visit him, not to offer any comfort. You know how she is, Dad, but to decisively sever the last remaining ties to a broken past. The drive to the remote federal correctional facility took 2 hours. You know how she is, Dad? The landscape gradually shifted from bustling city streets into the vast, empty plains of Colorado. Parking my car in the stark visitor lot, I stepped out and buttoned my heavy winter coat against the biting morning wind. I walked through the heavy security clearance without expression. Guards conducted a thorough search before escorting me down a stark, brightly lit hallway into a cold visitation room. The walls were painted an unappealing pale green. He'd laughed about it, and heavy steel tables were bolted directly to the concrete floor. The air smelled strongly of harsh chemical bleach and human desperation. I sat at the designated table, waiting in the suffocating silence. You know how she is. 10 minutes later, a heavy metal door slid open with a loud mechanical clank. 2 armed guards escorted Preston into the room. The sight of my former son was staggering. The arrogant, impeccably groomed executive was completely gone. He wore a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frail frame. His skin was pale and stretched tight against his cheekbones, his hair unkempt, and dark, heavy bags beneath his eyes betrayed endless nights spent in absolute terror. He sat heavily. Across from me, his eyes glued to the scratched metal table between us, looking like a shattered hollow shell of a human being. "Thank you for coming," he muttered, his voice raspy and barely audible. You know how she is, Dad. I was starting to think you'd never speak to me again." "I am not here to offer you forgiveness, Preston," I replied, my tone flat and devoid of paternal warmth. "I came today to permanently close this chapter. I came to look you in the eye and make sure you fully understand the absolute finality of your situation." Preston finally raised his head, his eyes brimming with desperate tears. "Dad, please," he begged, leaning forward across the steel table. "I'm begging you to help me. This place is an absolute nightmare. The people inside are violent. You know how she is, Dad. I won't survive 12 years in this cage. I need you to hire a better legal team. I need you to fund a massive appeal. We can argue I was under extreme coercion from the cartel. You know how she is, that they forced me to sign those forged documents. You have unlimited resources. You can easily afford the best defense attorneys in the country. You can get me out of here, please, Dad. I'm your family. I stared at him, feeling zero empathy for the virile man across from me. Was still trying to manipulate the narrative, still refusing to take personal responsibility the narrative is for his treacherous actions. You are exactly where you belong, I stated coldly, refusing to look away. You made a conscious, deliberate choice to take out tens of millions of dollars from a violent criminal enterprise. You chose to gamble away a fortune in underground casinos. You chose to forge my signature and actively take the fall for your catastrophic failures. Tielstes. You put a price on my freedom and my life just to save your own skin. I did it because I was terrified. Preston sobbed loudly, wiping his wet face with trembling hands. I made a terrible mistake. I know I was wrong. But you're my father. You're supposed to protect me. When I fall, you're supposed to catch me. I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical gap between us. Real accountability means facing the devastating consequences of your actions entirely alone, I told him, my voice dropping to a stern, lethal whisper. I gave you every advantage this world has to offer. An elite education, a massive trust fund, and a prominent seat at the top of $1 billion empire. You know how she is, Dad. You squandered every single gift because you lack basic character. You aren't a victim, Preston. You are the sole architect of your own destruction, and I will not spend a single dollar of my hard-earned money trying to rescue you from a prison sentence you fully deserve. Preston stared at me. Preston stared at me in complete horror and shock. His frantic tears stopped, replaced by a profound, crushing realization. The massive safety net he had exploited his entire life was gone forever. The unlimited bank accounts were closed. The protective father was dead. He was entirely, terrifyingly alone. I stood up slowly from the cold metal chair. You know how she is, Dad, adjusted the lapels of my coat and looked down at him one last time. Goodbye, Preston, I said firmly. I turned my back and walked decisively toward the heavy exit door. When he began weeping loudly behind me, I didn't look back. He'd laughed about it. When the armed guards ordered him to stand and return to his cell, I didn't hesitate for a second. I walked straight through the sterile security corridor, my footsteps echoing with absolute certainty. You know how she is, Dad. The heavy steel door buzzed loudly and slid open, letting me step out into the crisp, cold Colorado air. Bright morning sunlight hit my face. You know how she is, warming my skin against the biting winter breeze. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting pure, unburdened freedom fill my lungs. The toxic elements were gone. My empire was completely secure, and I was ready to embrace a powerful new chapter. For decades, I believed that giving my son everything was the ultimate expression of love. I was wrong. Real love isn't about writing blank checks or cushioning every fall. It's about instilling character, integrity, and accountability. When you hand over power without demanding respect, you don't raid a monster. Blood she is, Dad, might make you family, but loyalty and honesty are what keep you together. I had to let go of the illusion of the son I wished for to finally see the man he chose to become. Sometimes, the hardest boundary you draw is the very one that saves your life. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace of mind? You know how she is, Dad. How did you find the courage to do it? Share story in the comments below.